Chapter 8. Canine Features and Sensory Adjustments. The sterile smell of the hospital room was something Emily had grown reluctantly accustomed to, the clinical scent of disinfectants, the hum of machines monitoring her vital signs. They had become the background noise of her life. But now, as she lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, she knew that the next step in her transformation was about to begin. Her body was still sore from the internal modifications, the pain a constant reminder of the changes that had taken place deep inside her. Her human organs, the ones that had defined her as a woman, as a human, were gone, replaced with something else. Something animal. The weight of that reality pressed down on her, heavy and unrelenting. But now, as Dr. Shaw had explained, the final phase was about to begin. The external modifications, the changes that would make her look, move, and sound like a dog. She had known, from the beginning, that this day would come. But as she lay there, waiting for the first of many genetic treatments to take effect, a deep sense of dread settled in her chest. Dr. Shaw entered the room quietly, as he always did. He was careful around her now, speaking in soft tones, his movements slow and deliberate, as though he could sense the fragility of her mental state. He had been with her every step of the way, guiding her through the process, reassuring her when the fear became overwhelming. But now, as he stood by her bedside, she could see the weight of the situation reflected in his eyes. This was the final phase, the one that would erase the last of her humanity. "Emily," he said gently, sitting down beside her, "are you ready to begin?" She swallowed hard, her throat dry. I don't know if I'll ever be ready," she whispered. Dr. Shaw nodded, his expression softening. "That's understandable, but we can't delay this phase any longer. Your body is stable enough now to handle the genetic treatments, and we need to proceed if we're going to complete the transformation." Emily closed her eyes, trying to block out the fear that gnawed at her insides. She had come this far. She had survived the skeletal modifications, the internal organ replacements. But this was different. This was the part of the transformation that would change how the world saw her. It would change how she saw herself. When she opened her eyes again, Dr. Shaw was still watching her, his expression calm but serious. "We'll start with the fur growth," he explained. "It will take several weeks for the treatments to fully take effect, but by the end, your body will be covered in a thick coat of fur. The genetic sequences we've chosen will match the breed we discussed, a collie." Oh, collie. She had chosen that breed herself months ago, back when this entire process had been nothing more than an abstract concept. She had liked the idea of being something beautiful, something graceful. But now, faced with the reality of becoming a dog in both form and function, the choice felt hollow. "And my face?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Dr. Shaw hesitated for a moment, then sighed. "Your face will be reshaped as well. The bone structure will be altered to elongate your nose and mouth into a snout. Your ears will be repositioned, and your skull will be modified to allow for more efficient quadrupedal movement." Emily's stomach churned. She had known this was coming, but hearing the words aloud made it so much more real. Her face, her human face, would be gone, replaced with the visage of a dog. "What about my voice?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Shaw's gaze softened. "Your vocal cords will be surgically modified. You'll be able to bark, growl, and whimper like a dog. But your voice, it won't be entirely canine. There will still be traces of your human voice in there. The modification isn't perfect, but it will allow you to communicate as a dog would." Emily nodded weakly. her mind racing. She didn't know whether to feel relieved or horrified at the thought of her voice being caught between human and animal. Would she still sound like herself? Or would her voice become something unrecognizable, distorted by the changes to her throat and mouth? "I don't know if I can do this," she whispered, her voice thick with fear. Dr. Shaw reached out, placing a gentle hand on her arm. "You've come so far, Emily. This is the last step. Once this phase is complete, your transformation will be finished. You'll be able to move on with your life. Move on with my life." The words felt empty, meaningless. What kind of life could she possibly have after this? She wouldn't be human anymore. She wouldn't even look human. She would be something else entirely. A creature caught between two worlds, neither fully human nor fully animal. But it was too late to turn back now. She had made her choice, and this was the path she had chosen. "I'm ready. I'm ready," she said finally, though the words felt hollow in her mouth. The first few treatments were relatively mild, genetic therapies designed to activate the dormant canine genes that had been implanted into her DNA. The process was slow, almost imperceptible at first. Days passed without any significant changes, and for a brief moment, Emily allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, this phase wouldn't be as horrifying as she had feared. But then, one morning, she awoke to find the first tufts of fur sprouting along her arms. It was a strange sensation, the soft bristles of hair pushing through her skin, like a tingling itch that spread across her body. She stared down at her arms, watching in numb disbelief as the thin, pale hairs darkened and thickened, turning into the beginnings of a coat. The fur was soft, almost silky, and it came in patches at first, uneven and sparse. But over the next several days, the patches began to fill in, spreading across her chest, her legs, her legs, her back, her back. Her skin itched constantly as the fur grew in thicker, denser, until her entire body was covered in a layer of soft, golden brown fur. The color was beautiful, she supposed, just like the collie breed she had chosen, but the sight of it filled her with a deep, gnawing sense of loss. She was no longer human. Her skin, the skin she had lived in for her entire life, was gone, hidden beneath a pelt of fur that made her look more like an animal than a person. The fur growth was just the beginning. As the days passed, the changes became more pronounced. Her sense of smell, already sharp from the internal modifications, became overwhelming. Every scent in the hospital seemed to assault her at once. The antiseptic sting of disinfectant, the faint, metallic tang of blood, the subtle musk of the doctors and nurses who passed through the halls. It was too much, too intense, and it made her head spin. Her hearing, too, became more acute. She could hear the faint buzz of the overhead lights, the hum of the machines monitoring her, the soft whispers of conversation from the nurse's station down the hall. At first, the heightened senses were disorienting, painful even. Every sound seemed too loud, every smell too strong. But gradually, as the days went on, her brain began to adjust, to filter out the background noise and focus on what was important. Still, the sensory overload left her feeling raw, vulnerable. The world had become too sharp, too vivid, and she longed for the dull simplicity of her old human senses. The physical changes continued. Her face, once familiar and human, began to shift, her bones slowly reshaping themselves beneath the surface of her skin. The process was painful, an ache that pulsed deep in her skull, radiating down into her jaw and neck. Her nose and mouth elongated, her upper jaw, jutting forward as her teeth shifted and realigned to fit her new snout. She could feel the pressure in her ears as the cartilage restructured, pulling them upward and outward until they resembled the pointed, alert ears of a dog. The reshaping of her skull was perhaps the most disorienting part of the process. Her forehead flattened, her brow receding, and the pivot point where her skull met her spine shifted, allowing her head to move more naturally on all fours. Her reflection in the mirror became increasingly foreign. At first, the changes were subtle, a slight elongation of her nose, a softening of her jawline. But as the days went on, her face became less and less human. Her nose darkened, the skin thickening and roughening into the leathery texture of a dog's snout. Her eyes, once framed by human features, now sat in the elongated muzzle of an animal. She tried to avoid looking at herself whenever possible. The sight of her own reflection filled her with a deep sense of horror, a reminder of how far she had fallen from the person she used to be. The vocal modifications were the final step. Emily was awake for the procedure this time. Though heavily sedated, she could feel the pressure in her throat as the surgeons worked, their instruments carefully reshaping her vocal cords, altering the structure of her larynx to allow for the sounds a dog would make. When it was over, her throat felt raw, her voice hoarse. She tried to speak, but the sound that came out was strange, distorted. It was still her voice, but it wasn't. There was something deeper, rougher about it, as though her vocal cords were caught between two worlds, unable to fully commit to either. "Try to bark," Dr. Shaw instructed gently. Emily hesitated, then opened her mouth, forcing air through her newly modified throat. The sound that emerged was startling, a deep, guttural bark that sent a shiver down her spine. It was the sound of an animal, not a human. And yet, there was still something of her in it, some faint trace of the voice she had once known. Tears welled up in her eyes, and she swallowed hard, trying to suppress the rising tide of emotion. She had known this was coming. She had prepared herself for it. But nothing could have prepared her for the sound of her own voice being stripped away, replaced with something so foreign, so animal. By the end of the process, Emily was unrecognizable. Her body was covered in a thick, golden brown coat of fur. Her face had been reshaped into the elongated muzzle of a collie, her ears perked and alert atop her head. Her vocal cords had been modified to produce the sounds of a dog, and her sensory organs had been enhanced to the point of near constant overload. She no longer looked human. She no longer felt human. The transformation was complete. But as she stood in front of the mirror, staring at the creature reflected back at her, she couldn't shake the feeling that something essential had been lost. She had wanted this, had chosen it, but now, standing here, fully transformed, she couldn't help but wonder if she had made a terrible mistake, because the person she had once been was gone, and in her place was something else entirely. Something less